Welcome, dear friends and comrades. This is a very special edition of the anti-war debates, a common initiative of against censorship, without censorship internet channel, and Myśli Polskiej, the oldest independent Polish political magazine. I'm truly honored to introduce our guests. Clare Daly, Irish member of the European Parliament, member of Independence for Change, the left in the European Parliament, pro-neutrality, anti-war, anti-imperialist activist, and renowned Palestinian rights campaigner. Welcome, Clare.
Thanks very much.
Ambassador Peter Ford, diplomat, ambassador to Bahrain from 1999 to 2003, and Syria from 2003-2006. Determined opponent of the British military's involvement in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, member of the Workers' Party of Britain. Welcome, Ambassador Ford.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Happy to be here.
Tommy Sheridan, Scottish Socialist MSP and current chair of the Scottish independence campaign Hope Over Fear.
Hi, Konrad. Thank you for the invitation.
Mick Wallace, Irish member of the European Parliament, leader of Independence for Change, left in the European Parliament, renowned anti-war activist, a proven friend of the Palestinian case, engaged in supporting and anti-imperialist movements in the Middle East, Africa, and South America. Welcome, Mick.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Dear friends, we've met and intend to discuss just before one of the most important anniversaries, one of the most important moments, not just for Poland, but for the whole humanity. Speaking just before 1st of September, let me remind the word of Polish General Kazimierz Sosnkowski, Polish Commander-in-Chief, during the late period of the World War II. He has written to the Polish soldiers in 1944. 5 years have passed since the day when Poland, having listened to the encouragement of the British government and received its guarantees, stood alone in the fight against the German power. After this harsh but true reminder that Poland was pushed to fight by Britain, Churchill successfully demanded General Sosnkowski dismissal. Clare, can we say today that it was the encouragement of London and Washington that pushed Kiev to pursue a policy that resulted in the war with Russia?
Well, I think it was certainly under push from Washington and London that has led to the war continuing, because we know that there was a peace agreement on the table last April, which would have ended the conflict, which seemed to be acceptable to both Moscow and Kiev. But Boris Johnson in particular, and then aided by the US and probably elements of the European Union, basically told Ukraine to keep fighting. So in that sense, they have become, unfortunately, a prop or the stage upon which the West is fighting its proxy war with Russia. And the longer it goes on, the more Ukrainians are fed into the meat grinder, the more destruction, the more territory ceded. It's an absolute catastrophe for Ukraine, and they are in it certainly at the behest of their so-called Western friends who are no friends at all.
Yeah, you've mentioned about the Minsk agreement. We all know that it was absolutely death letter on the table, because it was never completed. It was never effective in the eastern Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. That's one of the main results of this tragedy.
Well,
Ambassador Ford. Yeah, Claire, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, even after the war had started in April, that agreement was there, where in return for Ukrainian neutrality and non-NATO membership, Russia would withdraw to the pre-February, and there was a roadmap, if you like, for how the territories in the Donbass and that would be sorted, but that was given up.
Yeah, and I believe that this experience of Ukrainian tragedy, let's say, as well, and the Donbass tragedy as well, is something which is very significant for all Eastern Europeans, including, of course, Polish people. Ambassador Ford, UK and USA together evidently try to involve Poland and Baltic states into the Ukrainian conflict. We all know that British Army trains and teaches Ukrainian military forces and also so-called volunteer battalions, including Nazi ones. Washington, London, unfortunately also Warsaw, sent tons of weapons and ammunition to Kiev. Do you think that such provocations could succeed and lead to the down of the what we all scared the most, or to the World War III?
Well, it's clear that US and UK policies are failing, and indeed never stood a chance of succeeding. From the beginning, policymakers in London and Washington were dreaming, were taking their wishes for reality. But of course, they were never likely to pay the full price. It was always going to be the Ukrainians who were thrown into that meat grinder. And therefore, running a high-risk policy was not actually high risk for London or Washington. And indeed, in domestic political terms, the policy which had been pursued by the British government has, I'm very sorry to say, been very successful in terms of popularity, with total command of the media, and no opposition from the official opposition. The British government has been able to pursue what has been undoubtedly a very popular policy, uncontested. And this is a result of the collapse of the British left. The British left has moved now to the right. In terms of foreign policy, the extreme right, or what I call the extreme center, because the center has been the most hysterical in several dimensions, not only foreign policy matters of not only Russophobia, but Covidophobia and Greenophobia, and every other passing fancy where people can get hysterical. So what was the British Peace Party has moved far to the right. It's worth remembering that just 10 years ago, 2013, the British Labour Party, in a vote in Parliament, prevented Britain bombing Syria. It was a very close call, and they needed some support from some brave conservative rebel MPs, but there was then a peace party in my country. Those days are long gone. And with the collapse of the real British, the true British left, all the parties are now in the extreme center and ready to fight to the last Ukrainian.
Yeah, I think that we will return to the collapse of the pro-peace movement and left in general, not only in Britain but also in the rest of Europe, also in Germany, in Poland as well, unfortunately. But yeah, I believe that it's the question of the wider context. Mick, if I can speak to the Mick Wallace, you observed tragic results of a lot of imperialist aggression, all over the world, in the Middle East, in Africa. We already know that there is significant increase in the military involvement of Polish forces in the Polish-Belarusian borders. They are German army sent to Lithuania, British army sent to Estonia. Do you find that it's possible to, that is the first step to the full-scale war in Europe? And how do you think, is it how it fit to the global context of the conflicts, imperialist conflicts in Africa, imperialist conflict in South Asia, in escalation in relations between America and China? This is this final element of the rivalry of competition of imperialists. How we can evaluate this global situation in context of Ukraine crisis?
Yeah, I suppose to put it in context, back in 1960, when Eisenhower was going out of power in America, he addressed the worry and concern about the build-up of what he described, probably the first time the term was used, but he described it as the military-industrial complex that the US were developing at an enormous rate, and at a rate that the entity was probably becoming more powerful than anybody was going to be able to control. Now, obviously, since then, we have seen a lot of military activity from the US. They have over 800 military bases worldwide. Since the Second World War, they drop more bombs every year than every other country put together. They have there's a certain elite element in the US that has a business interest in promoting war. Now, with regard to the wars that the US promote, you will have noticed that there's none of them on their land. So they're not quite as mad a risk to them as, for example, the present war is to Europe. Now, sadly, the Europeans have walked into this with their eyes closed. They don't seem to have thought out the consequences. They haven't thought about where this could go. I mean, we only had a debate at Foreign Affairs Committee on the refunding of Ukraine, and pretty shocked to hear some of the debate that took place and how unreasonable so much of it still is. There's still, I mean, you have people still saying that it's good, we must keep pumping arms into Ukraine or Ukraine will lose the war. Now, they're saying that Ukraine has to get back all its territory. Ukraine has to get back Crimea. Well, now, Ukraine are not getting back Crimea without a nuclear war. And has Europe thought about the idea of a nuclear war on the European continent, of a nuclear war? It's like as if they're in denial that it could happen. You mentioned the buildup of troops on the Belarus border and in the Baltic states. They're playing with fire. Now, listen, if you ask me, do I think this is going to escalate into a larger conflict between Russia and the NATO states of Europe and America? My honest opinion is I don't think so. But at the same time, Europe is being totally ridiculous in its approach. It is taking the risk that it could happen. War starts sometimes without being intended. I studied the origins of the First World War in university, and we went through the source papers of what was going on for the months before the war started. And, you know, some people think, well, it was inevitable. Well, actually, it wasn't. Wars aren't necessarily inevitable, but they happen sometimes when you're not careful and you take risks. And risks were taken then, and we're taking them now. And we're putting an awful lot at risk. Now, the American economy, I'd say, is not really suffering from this war. It's working class Ukrainians and working class Russians that are doing the dying. We have politicians in Europe that are not prepared to fight or send their children to fight in the same war that they're promoting. And not only that, but we have a 17% increase in food price in Europe in the last 12 months that is linked to the war. We have European politicians making calls that are not in the interest of their citizens. They're certainly not in the interest of the Ukrainians who are dying in large numbers. These people, sadly, we don't have listen, I've been saying all my life that politics doesn't really attract intelligent people. And there's an awful lot of a serious lack of strong leadership in Europe at the moment. Merkel wouldn't have liked our politics much, but she was tough, she was strong. I'm not so sure the war would have started if she was still in place. Scholz is weak. And we have a situation at the moment. I mean, there's no point in talking about the Brits. They're becoming almost a failed state. And we're at a situation where Macron probably looks like the strongest of the leaders of the main countries. God help us, because Macron is not impressive. And his speech, which I read from Monday through his ambassadors, is a little bit scary, right? So if he's the best of them, we have a big problem in Europe. And at the European institution level, von der Leyen has been a dangerous little individual. Borrell and Michel are just weak, but von der Leyen is actually a little bit dangerous. So we're at a time where leadership good leadership, strong leadership is in short supply, and we have politicians making decisions that actually don't impact on their lives very much, but are doing detrimental damage to many others. And as you said, putting a lot at risk in terms of the potential of things escalating.
Yes, I believe that speaking about some kind of crisis of Europe, European solidarity, European leadership is a very important aspect. As you know, I was in Ireland to listen your triple lock debate, neutrality debate, and well, I think that one of the few positives of that, it was that we could hear from the independent, of course, side, so many details about militarization of Europe. I believe that not everyone in European Union is even aware how militarized this structure became, since the especially Lisbon Treaty and all these joining initiatives with NATO, with Western European Union. That's very important, and some kind hidden information which is not fully known, also for Polish, well, mostly still euro enthusiastic audience. So it's a very important element to remind about that. But speaking about the great Europe, we're speaking about the even of each country separately as well, because Tommy Sheridan, you are one of the most famous pro-independence activists in Scotland. And, well, I believe, as being a Pole living in Scotland as well, I find it kind of, well, paradox that the Westminster government is so determined in supporting something they call Ukrainian independence, and in the same time, they provide evidently imperialist and neo-colonial policy also towards Scotland and to any other countries, especially former colonies, and also toward Eastern European countries. As a Scottish pro-independence socialist activist, how do you recognize situation in Ukraine, considering rights of minorities, rights of Russian language speaking majority of the east of Ukraine? How do you find the situation of these former eastern regions of Ukraine who voted for independence, like Donetsk, like the old Donbass, like previously Crimea, like Ruthenia, and other who supported federation or even pro-independence there? You are like Westminster like to say separatist. How do you think? So what do you think about the separatism there?
Konrad, thanks very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to share a platform, particularly with Claire and Mick. I don't know Peter well, but I admire the work of Mick and Claire in the European Parliament, a den of iniquity, but they shine the light of basic human solidarity whenever they can, and it's very, very welcome. Mick made a point there about the inevitability of wars sometimes, and sometimes that they're not inevitable. I was preparing for today's debate by reminding myself of the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe's report into the 2010 election in Ukraine. In the 2010 election in Ukraine, they said of that election, which Yanukovych won, the pro-Russian, anti-NATO president, that was described as an impressive display of democracy. An impressive display of democracy. The OSCE observers said it was a fully fair and very competitive election. And the reason I think it's important in a discussion like this that we remind ourselves of what happened in 2010 is because that leads us to what happened in 2014 when that victory, that impressive display of democracy was overthrown militarily, violently by neo-Nazis funded by America. That's now without dispute in relation to the leaked telephone conversations between the Ukraine and the US ambassador. It is clear that the US was behind that military violent overthrow of an elected government in 2010. Why? Because that government didn't want further links with NATO, didn't want to join NATO, wanted to retain their neutrality. And therefore, in terms of inevitability of this war, personally, I think it was inevitable after the coup of 2014, because several months thereafter, Ukraine announced that it was reaching out to NATO. And NATO, in its absolute stupidity, said, yes, we would welcome Ukraine. Is it any wonder then that Pope Francis has the courage last year to make the point that none of the European political leaders have had the balls and courage to make, and that is that Russia was provoked in relation to the invasion. The dog barking at the door, as Pope Francis said. When the dog keeps barking at the door, inevitably there is a response. Would the American government be happy if China announced tomorrow that it was sighting nuclear weapons in Mexico? All we need to do is look at history. The 61 Cuban Missile Crisis nearly brought us a nuclear war. Why? Because Russian missiles were going to be put on Cuba, 90 miles from America. America didn't like it. So why should Russia be prepared to accept its neighbour having NATO nuclear weapons within its territory? Quite frankly, Conrad, that's what, in my opinion, made the war inevitable. There was no way that Russia could allow its sovereignty to be so endangered. And it is horrible for a socialist like myself, who is completely and utterly anti-war, particularly anti-nuclear weapons and the whole idea of military might. I hate it, because the only people that ever suffer are working class people. That's the ones who die in wars. We know that. We know that from experience. But I have to tell you, if I was Vladimir Putin in the similar situation, quite frankly, what else would you do but to invade, to try and defend your sovereignty? So in many respects, I think this war has been made inevitable by the actions of NATO, led, of course, by the United States of America. And I have to say, Conrad, that I think they have miscalculated. I think they thought with the funding and arming of Ukraine and the imposition of absolute widespread sanctions, Russia would collapse. And what has happened is China, India, Brazil, Argentina, other countries across the planet have said, sorry, we don't want part of your imperialist expansion. We're no longer willing to nod to whatever America says. I think there's a reconfiguration of the world going on before our very eyes right now. I think the recent BRICS conference just last week there in Egypt indicated that I think almost a third of the global output is now going to be part of the BRICS organization and moving away from NATO and NATO-inspired economic cooperation. So, Conrad, I think there's a lot of things going on in the world. The most tragic thing is the loss of Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian citizens. It is absolutely terrible. But if I was forced into a position of saying, would I have supported that invasion if I was a Russian citizen? I'm going to have to be honest and say, yes, I would, because I think Russia's sovereignty is at stake here.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. I would say that, well, I've worked in Ukraine for many years. I worked for Polish self-government in the eastern Poland. I have a lot of friends in Ukraine. I was journalist in Ukraine as well. And now in TV news, I recognize the places I know with all these, bombs and rockets on that, prepared to war, preparing thousands and millions of innocent people for death. They really didn't want to be involved in. It's absolutely tragedy, but I believe that a lot of Polish families also remember so-called Cuban crisis in the 60s, and we older of us remember perfectly that it has begun not with Soviet involvement in Cuba, but in American involvement in Turkey, and American missiles in Turkey, just in the range of Baku and industry areas in Soviet Union. So it's always some imperialist actions in the one step before, and we have to remember about it. Speak about provocations. I would say that considering all these threats we are talking about, understanding the risk we are playing with, or our governments are playing with. Let's talk about possible solutions, if you can, of course, imagine any. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I was in Ireland to hear a debate about neutrality, and I'd like to ask. First is the question to me, but of course I ask you all to join. Is it issue of neutrality is still up to date in the present world? Because we know that after Western encouragement or Western orders, Kiev declined of neutrality. Finland has joined NATO. Ireland is pushed to NATO. Sweden applied to NATO. Is it still place for some kind of non-alignment international movement, some kind of pro-neutrality coalition, some kind of the new Bandung spirit? Is it still possible? Nick, what do you think?
Yes, it's difficult, right? When the non-aligned movement was started at the beginning of the 60s, it seemed like a real powerful opportunity to do things different, but it was quashed, and it was quashed more by the Americans than by anybody else. They didn't want this to happen, and there hasn't really been a serious effort to get it back on track. But there's no doubt about it. The potential lies there for it. And you have countries like Brazil, you have African countries, Latin American countries in particular, who are eager to develop the idea. Now, you were talking earlier there about the BRICS summit last week. Now, I mean, could the BRICS entity lead towards that? It could play a role. Now, most people will probably just see the BRICS thing as that's the China camp, that's the Russia camp. But if you look at the countries that they're eager to bring in, they very much focused on economic unity rather than political unity in the selection of new countries. For example, bringing in Argentina, bringing in Ethiopia and Egypt. I mean, these countries have strong relationships with the Western powers. And they were prepared to join the BRICS, and the BRICS were prepared to take them in. I suppose the big question is, can China be a sort of a neutral player, even though the fact that is becoming incredibly powerful? It will probably be the largest economy in the world within 10 years. And what will it be like when it's number one? Well, we don't know that yet because it hasn't happened, right? We like to think that China will not be aggressive, that they will not be expansionist. Traditionally, in their history, they haven't been expansionist, and you'd like to think that they won't be. But whether they can actually, despite being very powerful, whether they can play that role where they could actually help the non-aligned movement to grow is a challenge, right? But there's been an awful lot of damage done, in particular since the end of the Second World War. An awful lot of lives destroyed. Millions of people have been killed. Tens of millions have been displaced. Capitalism, as we know it, has kind of failed. And with the environmental challenges as well, the perpetual growth, which is at the core of capitalism, is not really sustainable if we want to save the planet. These endless wars are not sustainable if we want to save the planet. The military-industrial complex has a greater toll of emissions than aviation and shipping put together, but people don't talk about that. But all the destruction that has been imposed on different parts of the world through military activity isn't acceptable anymore, and it isn't good enough. And it does point to the fact that we have to actually start behaving in a more sensible fashion, and we have to stop letting any imperial power dictate like they have in the past. It won't be easy. It's hard to fight power and money, but we would like to think that where we've been heading for a number of years now is not good. Something has to give. We need something different. We need change. And we need governments to realign themselves, and they need to start prioritizing the interests of their citizens rather than perpetually prioritizing the interest of big business, because that hasn't been happening. I don't want to start talking about neoliberalism, but as Chomsky said, he described it as capitalism with the gloves off, where the interest of large business is prioritized 100% above those of the ordinary citizen. But the planet hasn't been going in a good direction for a while, and a non-aligned movement could be an incredibly positive force. But as I said, it's challenging to bring it about. But you know what? There's been a lot of challenging things in the past, and Rome wasn't built in a day, but it was started, and we should gather together like-minded countries now towards building a real non-aligned movement and get as many countries to join in time, because this is the way forward.
Can I just add to that, Conrad? Because I think Mick is right, but I suppose where I would differ is I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think there's a momentum behind that now, because too often those of us in Europe look at the situation from a sort of an Atlanticist lens of Western media coverage. But the reality is that the countries where most of the world's population live haven't taken sides in this war. They haven't bent the knee to Western propaganda. And it's those countries like, this war has been led by the military-industrial complex. We know that NATO is responsible for 3/4 of global arms expenditure every year. This is where the drive is coming from. But actually, neutrality is more important than ever before. Mick explained the situation nationally. But even inside Europe, let's look at that. Because there is a divide between what the governments say in the countries of Europe and how the people think. Because you made the point of the meetings in Ireland and the discussions around militarisation. One of the reasons why those discussions happen in Ireland is we're the only country which puts these issues to the people for a vote. So the people of Finland and the people of Sweden didn't have a vote in their countries joining NATO. Their governments decided it over their heads. And we find ourselves contacted every week, every day probably, by people all over Europe and beyond who thank us for speaking out for peace and rational argument and for not going along with the warmonger. So those exist in countries all over Europe. And that's why for us, you know, there are other neutral countries, obviously on the global scale, but even in Europe, Malta, Austria, Ireland, Cyprus, we're still there. The battle to erode Ireland's neutrality has a real importance now for everybody, because if they succeed in bullying us out of it, that's a setback for everybody in Europe. I remember, seeing as we are talking to a Polish audience, when we got elected first, being on the Security and Defence Committee and talking about the need for neutrality and how we were proudly neutral, and there was a Polish MEP sitting beside me, and he went mad and he just said, the cheek of you, how could you dare be neutral? It's all right for you sitting over there on the other side of Europe. You don't have a big neighbour, Russia, invading you before, you know. So obviously my answer to that was, well, you are totally right, sir. But we did have a different, bigger neighbour on bullying us and occupying us in the form of Britain. But I didn't see anybody coming and arguing that the response to that was go out and arm the IRA. It wasn't. The response to that was negotiate a peace agreement. And there's an irony in this, and it relates to the question you asked Tommy earlier, that those who are saying they want to defend Ukrainian sovereignty and so on don't care about Scottish sovereignty or other sovereignty in other areas. But ironically, they're the same people who are saying that Ukraine has to reclaim every ounce of its territory, including Crimea, are the same people who say that the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement is historic. It was a great step forward, even though 17% of the territory of Ireland is still under British rule. But people aren't getting killed, so they kind of say, well, isn't that great? So you can see the hypocrisy there. But my point just being is I think neutrality is more important. And that's why a country like Ireland, which is firmly in the Western camp, but was colonised and has that history, could have played a really good role when we were on the Security Council, along with Mexico, which is a big neutral country. They put forward the idea of a peace plan. Ireland didn't even back that. That's how bad we've become. But so many of the European leaderships are like that. But that's different than the way the European people think. And I think, you know, there is a danger that a lot of countries, particularly some of the Polish representatives, are very cavalier. They're very, naive in terms of their saber rattling against Russia. They're doing it nicely, sitting in the comfort of their sort of cocoon in Brussels. They won't be going out losing their lives in an aggravated conflict. So I think neutrality is more important now.
Yeah, I believe that there is very typical for this so-called Polish political debate that it's always silenced with, okay, neutrality is good for countries far, far away, but we are here, so there is no other choice. But every time we can hear that, or we can hear Polish Defense Minister Błaszczak, who said that Poland is going to build the biggest army in Europe, we can always hear, this sound of billions of dollars transferred to the military-industrial complex, and that's the reason of this jingoism, of this pretending patriotism of our leaderships, and that's the same problem, very, very common in the not only for the Eastern Europe. Ambassador Ford, you know perfectly British diplomacy. You know exactly how foreign office works, how the system looks from the inside. We know already that Mr. Martin Harris has been appointed His Majesty's ambassador to Ukraine in succession of Dame Melinda Simons. And well, but apart from that, we know just a wee about this hidden diplomacy of foreign office of Westminster of number 10. We know, for example, now that it was Boris Johnson who pushed Zelensky against the peace proposals of Moscow, against some kind of negotiation in Istanbul. Do you think that especially British activity could prevent any kind of diplomatic solution in Ukraine?
Yes, the role of Britain can only be negative. I'm sorry to say, but that it has been the truth so far, and it will remain the truth for the foreseeable future. Britain was already instrumental in preventing peace in Syria. Boris Johnson intervened very early after Trump was first elected. He went to Washington to persuade Trump not to withdraw US troops from Syria as Trump was intending. And we're seeing the same thing playing over again with Ukraine. Now, maybe it won't work a second time. I don't think Britain will have much influence on Trump Mark II. On the contrary, I think Trump Mark II is pretty anti-British by now. And there is some hope there. I think, actually, realistically, I think the best hope for some sort of peace, or at least ceasefire, frozen conflict, but anyway, an end of hostilities, is Trump coming in. And indeed, even before he might be elected, his possible victory casts a long shadow. Biden has to take into account that Trump's Ukraine policy of distancing himself and taking America out of the conflict is quite popular in America. So everybody will soon have to start adjusting their calculations in light of at the moment, possible Trump victory, but soon, I think, probable Trump victory. And paradoxically, it was America that started this conflict, basically, but it's America that can end it. The British can only make things more complicated and difficult. And the history of Britain and Poland at the origin of the Second World War is not reassuring in this context. I don't want to open any old sores about the Second World War, but Britain went to war not because it was attacked by Germany, but to defend Poland, which had got itself into serious trouble involving ethnic minorities. So that is not an encouraging precedent. One can only hope that British diplomacy will be ignored by the rest of the world.
Yeah, I believe that your also Syrian experience is very important to understand Ukrainian crisis, because it's another example when we hear about fighting for peace, which only increase the war threat for the country involved. Just to keep it further, you are very critical for the British diplomacy activity in the Syrian crisis. Do you find the same processes, the same mechanisms within British policy towards Ukraine?
Absolutely, and in the Syria conflict, a big part of the explanation for Britain's attitude has been Russophobia, because the Syrian government was forced to ally itself with Russia when it was desperate, when the forces of ISIS were at the gates of Damascus. That Russian help was crucial. Britain never forgive Syria for being close to Russia, and in a way, Syria is paying the price for its alliance with Russia. Indeed, the Syrian conflict was like a preparation for the Ukraine conflict. You saw the same lineup of opposing forces, basically, the same use of proxies. So in Syria, the Western powers were using jihadi militias and Kurdish separatist militias. And of course, in Ukraine, they're using the Ukrainian armed forces as their proxies. So many parallels, down to the technical level, the use of propaganda, the use of fake news, and the creation of a monolithic narrative in the mainstream media. The Western powers, particularly Britain, honed their media manipulation skills in the Syria conflict, in particular through the use of the state broadcaster, the BBC, which is the main cheerleader for the conflict, or Britain's role in the conflict in Ukraine as well as Syria. So many parallels, all pretty nefast, unfortunate.
I believe that we also experience the element of this not only black PR but directly censorship in Poland. Our independent newspapers like Polska Magazine are under censorship of political police in Poland. Our independent channels are blocked, and we are still under threat of arrests and other kind of, like European Parliament like to say, illiberal practices. It's not illiberal practices, it's authoritarianism. It's not Atlantist, not authoritarianism. Tommy, you are also a veteran of anti-war activity. Are you able to explain what has happened to the anti-war movement in Scotland, in England, in the whole Europe? What has happened with people who gathered against the Iraqi war, who previously protested in Faslane, in Greenham, in Menwith Hill? What has happened with Greenpeace, now sponsored by military corporations? What has happened with Greens, which in Scotland and in England and in Germany, of course, just transfer themselves to the pro-NATO, pro-imperialist position? What has happened to the anti-war movement? Has these people forgotten about the war treaty?
You know, Conrad, Mick earlier on pointed to the crisis of leadership within the movement in the West, and I would similarly reflect that Western politics at the superficial level of mainstream politics is utterly barren. Peter talked earlier about the Peace Party, and I know the point he was making, but you would have to make the point further that so-called Peace Party, i.e. the Labour Party, which used to be held up as the alternative party in the UK, was the party that took us into Iraq on a prospectus of lies and deceit. It was the party that quite clearly has been behind the scenes, promoting and supporting and mimicking everything the Tories have said in relation to Ukraine. Where are the voices of the left? As Peter raised that point, where are the voices of the left standing up in Parliament and saying categorically This is a NATO-provoked war. They have no interest in the sovereignty or interest of Ukraine. Their only interest is first and foremost the promotion of the military-industrial complex, the signing of more and more armaments agreements in order that they can sell more and more weapons, and secondly, to destroy Russia on the basis of improving their economic dominance of the world. As I said earlier, I think it's backfired. I think the fact that Russia has, at the very least, if not the support, the neutrality of China, of India, of Brazil, of Argentina. I was looking at the vote, Conrad, the United Nations vote, and the West would always say, oh, look at this, overwhelming. I think it was 135 countries voted to condemn the invasion of Iraq, of Ukraine, and called for Russia to withdraw. But when you study the 35 countries that abstained and the 5 countries that voted against, you'll find that 2/3 of the world's population is actually either opposed to the withdrawal or is neutral on the question. In other words, we get into this Atlantist, Westist approach of we speak for the majority. Everything we say is right because we're the West. I'm afraid we are a minority on the planet now. And although I'm painting, I think, a bit of a pessimistic picture in terms of the West, let's take some encouragement from what's been happening in Latin America over recent years, where there has been the election of, at the very least, neutral, if not outwardly anti-US imperialist parties in countries like Chile, like Bolivia, like Argentina, the continuing maintenance of Venezuela. And now, I mean, for goodness sakes, if we didn't have the Ukraine conflict, we would be having a discussion like this, asking ourselves, how is it in West Africa that there have been 4 coups against French neocolonialism in the space of 3 years? French's neocolonialism is collapsing before our eyes. So there's a lot of complexity going on in the world. It's not all one direction. I feel, as I said at the very start, that I think there's a world reconfiguration taking place, and that inevitably leads to many conflicts, many consequences, not all of which that we can control. But we, those of us who believe in fundamental socialist principles, we have to always refer to what is in the interest of the class that we come from and the class that we try and represent, the working classes. And war is never the solution for working class people, because war only means one set of working class people killing another set of working class. That's all war is. So we have a duty in each of our countries to continually oppose war and be part of the anti-war movement, no doubt about it. But don't let anybody say being anti-war means you're pro-Ukrainian, because I'm not pro-Ukrainian. I am in despair at the number of accounts on Facebook and elsewhere where you see Ukrainian flags, because the whole media campaign was to be sympathetic towards Ukraine without any analysis of the fact that this war hasn't started February 22. It started 9 years ago in 2014. It started and was going on for 8 years with a loss of 14,000 people in the eastern part, the Russian-speaking part of Ukraine. No one explains that context, that essential history to what has actually happened in relation to this conflict. We have a duty to do that. We have a duty to highlight that the Western media was stories about the neo-Nazis in the Ukraine government and army prior to last year, but those stories have been dropped somehow or other. The neo-Nazi problem seems to have disappeared. It's remarkable. Yet we have to have the courage and the tenacity to keep raising these things. And I think Claire is absolutely right when she talks about not being taken in by the fact that the countries of the West announce things. We don't get the vote on whether we support the Ukraine war. Nobody said the vote on whether we support Ukraine and the war. It's just been taken for granted. Well, I'm afraid that should not be taken for granted. We have to demand more debate, more discussion, informed debate and discussion about the real consequences and the real background and context to this conflict.
Well, I would say that even from my own life experience, if anyone could call themselves pro-Ukrainian, I proved with my life that I help Ukraine with humanitarian pomoc, help with humanitarian and supporting democracy in Ukraine as well. And I can say that, yes, I am pro-Ukrainian. That's why I want to this war to stop. That's why I want this Nazi oligarchic government in Kiev to collapse. That's why I want Ukrainian people to decide about themselves. That's the fact, not about any other rule. And it's not a question of symmetries. It's a question of understanding the right to self-determination future of nations. I believe that we all can understand that Ukrainian people should have such a right against this NATO aggression, NATO occupation over the Kiev. But I said that it's very sad when you observe these Ukrainian flags over government buildings in London, on the Foreign Office and Defense Ministry. I saw that in Dublin. I saw that in Hollywood as well, unfortunately. And of course, there are a lot of them in Warsaw because they're not a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. It's a symbols of Ukrainian tragedy, tragedy of the nation who is under Atlantic occupation. That's what we have to say. Yeah, well, I think that we all agree that the moment when anti-war movement should repeat words of some renowned leader, that it's time for war for palaces, war for corporations, and peace for households. And that's the point, because I totally agree with absent today George Galloway, who said that he's not pacifist. He is anti-war because he want war against imperialism, not a war against the people, and that's the point. And well, asking our noble guests for conclusions, I would like only to emphasize one element. Just in the days I've read in Polish newspapers about new loans, new armament supply for Kiev, new billions for further providing this war. And I would say that we never reach the peace with sending more weapons. That's absolutely impossible. That's the only way of capitalist accumulation on armament industry. Asking you for conclusions, asking you maybe for something optimistic, if it's possible to say anything optimistic about this tragedy in Ukraine. Do you think that can we, from our positions, living in our countries, living in Ireland, in Scotland, in England, in Poland, can we do as activists, as journalists, as politicians, as ordinary people, to do something to stop this war, to stop this tragedy, to prevent World War III? Is anything possible? Mick, what do you think?
Yeah, listen, the issue was touched on there by Tommy. As early as last summer, when the war was only a little over 4 months old, the European Council for Foreign Relations ran a survey across 10 of the main countries in Europe. And one of the main questions they asked was, do you think we should continue to punish Russia, or should we look for peace? 12 months ago, over 12 months ago now, over 70% of the people of Europe voted for peace. That figure reached 80% within 2 or 3 months. So what you had 80% of the people of Europe wanting peace, not wanting war. But we had 80% of the MEPs in the European Parliament wanting war. Clare and myself twice put in an amendment to the resolution on Ukraine and Russian war in the plenary in Strasbourg. And our amendment to the resolution called for the EU to maximize its potential to bring about peace, bring about dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war. 80% of the MEPs voted against it. Now think about that. And yet we had 80% of the people not wanting war. The politicians don't represent the citizens, and they rarely have, probably never. And they certainly don't now. How do we make things better? We have a mainstream media that's complicit with the imperials. They're complicit with the NATO project in Europe. A lot of them have been bought at this stage. It's a big problem. But yet, the general public don't believe everything that they're telling them. Otherwise, 80% of them wouldn't have chosen peace rather than continuing to punish Russia as their choice. We need to tap in to the people more. We have to stop putting so much focus on the institutions and on the political individuals who are not showing any appetite to fix things and make things better. They are not showing any concern for the lives of Ukrainians that are dying in massive numbers, or the Russians for that matter. We need, the people feel different about these things. The people don't want war, and they know war is stupid and it doesn't fix anything. And we've got to mobilize the people more to pressure the decision makers into copping onto themselves and bringing some common sense to the equation.
Clare?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that the response of the European establishment and the US so far has been to say that their response is more arms, keep the war going and all the rest of it, and we'll help rebuild Ukraine and all this kind of stuff. Now, sadly, the price of that is going to be borne by the taxpayers of Europe, who are not going to buy it, quite frankly. And that's not because they don't have solidarity with the people of Ukraine, because you're totally right, they do. And they've shown that dramatically so by welcoming so many refugees, as they should. But I think, you know, for all the talk, this isn't standing with Ukraine, because they're not giving them grants, they're giving them loans, which are going to be bled out of whatever population remains inside Ukraine. So that is a bad vision, if you like, of the future. But sadly, out of that brutality, I think already we've seen so many people seeing through the propaganda. And I do think, as many of the panel have said, it's in the hearts and minds of people are not buying this. And that's the embryo, if you like, of my positivity. Because I think we will see elections all across Europe. The people are sick of what's coming from the mainstream. There is a huge problem that there isn't a clear alternative there. And I think what comes out of that then is going to be pretty confused and all over the place. But our job, and where we should focus on, and all we can do, is focus and put pressure on our own governments, not to play along and be hijacked and the hostages of the military-industrial complex, which we're even seeing in Ireland now. So our job is very much to defend our neutrality. And I take great heart out of the fact that even in the conversation that we've had in Ireland, it's not a done deal. I think Peter's point earlier about the role of the media and how this, we all know the truth is the first casualty of war. But even in the Iraq war, you could put forward an anti-war position and not be demonized, despite all of the lies. In this war, it wasn't actually the first time, because Peter is right. It started with Syria. that if you tried to have a discussion at all, you were shut down. So most people actually, I think as we do, it's just they've been shut down and they're afraid to speak out. And that's one of the challenges that we have to come across. So I do think that talking to each other like we're doing now, using social media and all of these things are very important, because people certainly don't want their money going on guns and destruction when there's so much dire need out there, even in Europe, not to mind the rest of the world. But the other positivity, of course, is the one we touched on earlier about what's happening in the rest of the world, that they thought this war was going to end Russia and sort of rescue US dominance. It won't. It's actually going to accelerate the decline of US empire, which was already underway. And the alternative to that, we're beginning to see.
Yeah. Ambassador Ford, may Mr. Sunak take back cavalry? Is it possible?
Well, to be honest, I think the only real hope comes from across the Atlantic, with a second Trump presidency. This would change the weather on war and give a boost to populist trends. I mean, our problem in Europe is that we basically have a set of uni parties. So all the parties are more or less the same, controlled by similar managerial elites. What we need, perhaps, is a dose of populism, Trump style. We also need deep cultural change as well. You asked earlier what happened to the Peace Party. Well, they're demonstrating about the environment now. This is encapsulated in the Greenpeace NGO. They used to be green and they were also for peace. They're not for peace anymore. They've been completely seduced by the green part of their mission. And this is where all our young people have gone. The children and grandchildren of the people who sat outside US bases in the 1980s are now marching for the environment. I think there'll have to be deep cultural change for this to move back to concern about issues of war and peace. But in the meanwhile, I'm voting Trump.
Yeah, well, I would say that's very important. I of course remember this French imperialist attack on the Rainbow Warrior. So I absolutely remember how the peace movement was involved in anti-war movement. It was absolutely the same. It was equal, yeah, to be for environment, so against the wars. That was absolutely fact. And something has changed in these years, unfortunately. And speaking about changes, I only hope that any change in Washington, D.C. won't mean that we replace war in Ukraine with war in the Yellow Sea, because that could be one of the possible results. But well, finger crossed, maybe not. Tommy, can you tell us what is a believable scenario, how this war could really end?
I think the only inevitable end for me, Conrad, will be around a negotiating table. Every war in history has always ended around a negotiating table. It's just how quickly you can get to that table without further loss of life that matters, and we need to have an acceleration in getting to that table. I don't think there is any way there will be a peace without a reconfiguration of Ukraine. Parts of Ukraine will be no longer part of the Ukrainian sovereign state. They will be either independent republics or directly aligned with Russia. I don't think there can be a peace agreement that permits Ukraine to join NATO, because if that happens, then Russia will feel directly threatened. So that, to me, is the only way that there's going to be peace. If NATO withdraws its clause and stops this insane expansion, which is based on no military sense whatsoever, and is all about the US and economic domination and nothing about genuine security. China doesn't have hundreds of military bases surrounding America. It's America that has hundreds of military bases surrounding China. We have to, telling the truth in times of deceit is a revolutionary act, as George Orwell once said. And what a sign of desperation it is, Conrad, because Peter, and I respect his honesty when he talks about Trump, but what a sign of world desperation that sensible people with genuine, decent views feel that their only alternative is to vote for Donald Trump. That, to me, sums up how desperate a situation we're in, where your alternative is Joe Biden, an out-and-out warmonger, proved track record of being a warmonger, war supporter, deceit in relation to Iraq and other interventions, or Donald Trump, who, in my opinion, is an out-and-out racist, misogynist, someone whose only interest is himself and his personal wealth. But that's the alternative for the so-called greatest democracy on the planet. What an absolute joke that is. I think Claire and Mick are so important in relation to this point. I want to finish on about telling the truth and speaking truth to power, because, one of their fellow countrymen, Oscar Wilde, in relation to truth, when he was arguing against it ever being plain or simple, made the point that truth is rarely pure and never simple, but it has to be spoken in the corners of power. And that's why what those guys are doing in the European Parliament is so important. And whenever we get the opportunity to share these speeches, we have to do so, because we have to encourage other people out there that there is an alternative that's based on human solidarity. Working class people across the planet linking their hands and saying, no, we don't want more bombs. We want more hospitals. We don't want more missiles. We want our kids to have a decent education. Those are the alternatives. But unfortunately, we don't have political parties putting those alternatives on the order paper any longer. We need to fight and organise to get those alternatives onto the order papers all across Europe.
Yeah, I would say that that's the point. And I think that's the moment we all agree that, of course, we know exactly, unfortunately, that there is no business like war business, and that there is always has to be some war with Eurasia or with Australasia, and Oceania has always been at war. And it probably never stops till we not stop the capitalist exploitation and imperialist oppression. And, well, someone could say that it's too ambitious plan to reach, but I would say, but it's the plan. To stop the capitalism, to stop imperialism, to stop the war. Thank you, my dear friends, dear comrades. Thank you, our viewers. I believe that you enjoyed our discussion, and our guests today during this special edition of anti-war debates of Without Censorship internet channel and Myśli Polska weekly magazine. Our noble guests were Clare Daly, Irish member of the European Parliament. Thank you very much, Clare.
It's a million for having us. Thanks so much, Conrad.
Thank you. Ambassador Peter Ford, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you very much, Conrad.
Tommy Sheridan, comrade from Scotland. Thank you very much, Tommy.
Thank you, comrade.
And Mick Wallace, member of the European Parliament, Independent for Change, Ireland.
Thank you very much. And I just remind Tommy that in that country, that great democracy, don't ever forget that it cost $2 billion to become president.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, and see you soon. I hope we will still be all free. Thank you very much. See you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.